Hey, how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing a very exciting video where I give you some horror book recommendations for books that are on the longer side. So I'm talking 400 plus pages. So if you're new to my channel, you might not know that I've actually done a number of like horror book recommendations, just in general kind of videos that I'll have linked down below. I've also recently done a video that's like short horror book recommendations for books that are like 200 pages or less and like that kind of vibe. So if that's what you're looking for, I'll have that linked down below as well. But I thought I would make a video to recommend some of my favorite horror books that are 400 plus pages, because even though I do argue a lot of the time that there is no reason for a horror book to be that long and that I can easily get scared by something that's a lot on the shorter side, usually I am the kind of person who does enjoy a little bit shorter of a horror novel, but every now and then I'll read these horror novels that are a bit on the lengthier side and I will be so impressed by them. I feel like the benefits of having a longer horror novel is that it gives you more time with the characters, you can get more attached to the characters, and sometimes it can just be really fun to take on a massive book, especially at this time of year, which is why I wanted to make this video now during the winter season. I usually find during like the fall and the winter months is when I crave reading the longer books as opposed to the summer and the spring when my attention span is a little bit all over the place. And I also wanted to do this video this month because for my book club, the Book Troop, we are going to be reading The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, which this one is a horror novel that comes in at about 568 pages. So this is by far going to be the longest book that I've had for my book club so far, but this is one that I'm really excited to read this month and I've heard nothing but great things. So this would be a great place to start maybe if you're looking for some long horror book recommendations. I thought I would mention that I'm going to be reading this one this month, so maybe you could read it along with me. Yeah, anyways, in this video I'll be starting with the shortest recommendations, like the books that are about 400 plus pages, and then I'll be making my way through to the longest book recommendations. I'll put timestamps below for the different like page counts. If you don't think 400 plus pages is that long of a book, like I totally get that. If you want to fast forward to the 500 plus pages, then I will have the timestamps linked down below if you wanted to jump around, but let's just get right into it. So the first book I wanted to recommend is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This one just barely comes in at about 404 pages. Grady Hendrix can be a very hit or miss author for me, but this one in particular really worked for me. I thought this one was so interesting and so entertaining, and this book takes place in the 90s. We're following this group of women who all run a book club. They live in the South. When this man shows up to their book club and they start to suspect that he might be a vampire, and he decides to join their book club, and then shit starts really hitting the fan from there. I think what Grady Hendrix does so well is that he's able to write such a compelling story with really interesting characters, but his horror is still so well written. It's so creepy and disturbing and it really gets under your skin. The next book on this list comes in at 406 pages, and that is The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is an author that I have really enjoyed a lot of her books, so it wasn't very surprising that I also ended up enjoying this one. This one actually is a young adult horror novel, but the thing that I think is especially cool about this book and why I would recommend it to fans of horror is that this book is actually a retelling of Carrie by Stephen King, and we're following this young girl, Maddie, who has been severely bullied at her high school. This book also has a lot of social commentary that I found to be really thought-provoking, and you know, it really shows the racism that exists in this small town, and that only contributes to the horrific aspects of this book. But it's not often that I would recommend a young adult horror book, but this was one that I really enjoyed. The next one also comes in at 406 pages, so again, just barely over that 400 page mark, but I have to mention it because it's Reprieve. This was one of my favorite books when I read it a few years ago. I was really surprised by this one, but I think this book is also getting a lot of negative reviews because people are going into this one with the wrong expectations. This book is definitely a very slow burn, almost like literary feel kind of style of writing. The description says that this is a relevant literary novel of social horror centered around a brutal killing that takes place in a full contact haunted escape room. It says it's a provocative exploration of capitalism, hate politics, racial fetishism, and our obsession with fear as entertainment. And even though this one has the setting of the escape room, that's not really the full story. I feel like this is a very thought-provoking literary kind of novel that really makes you think about us as a society, and I just thought it was really good. It was really deep. It's not as like on the page graphic scary as you might imagine it to be. It's more like psychological, like it really gets in your head, and I really liked that about this one. And then we have one of my all-time favorites, Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. This one's coming in at about 416 pages. This book is one of my favorites because we're following 4 horror authors, and they decide to spend Halloween night in the most haunted house in America that's called Kill Creek, and it's going to be getting live streamed to everyone in the world. And this premise is so interesting. This book was so much fun. I love how like meta this book is because it's horror authors writing about horror and talking about writing horror. It's just very interesting, and even though this book is on the lengthier side, it had me gripped from the first page. I could not put this book down, and the ending ending completely shocked me personally. Like, I really loved where the story ended up going. And then coming in at 436 pages, we have Dead 11. And this horror book is also really fun because it mostly takes place on an island, and like the island vibes in this book are freaking immaculate. So we're following this protagonist named Willow, and her son has recently passed away, but then she finds the words Clifford Island sketched onto his like bedroom floor, and she's like, what is this place? So she goes to Clifford Island to try and find answers about her son, and then Willow herself goes missing. And so then we're following Willow's brother as he's trying to find his sister and track down the truth about what really happened at this mysterious island. And what's really cool about this island is that everyone has this really strange obsession with the year 1994. It's like they all wear the same outdated clothes from 1994, and they all avoid technology, and they just watch the O.J. Simpson car chase on the TV like every single day. It's just really creepy and weird. Like, this definitely unlocked some new fears within me that I didn't even know that I had. And then we have The Good House, which is also by Tananarive, and this one comes in at about 482 pages. This one is interesting because we have the classic kind of like haunted house trope happening in this book. In this story, we're following this protagonist named Angela, who has this failing marriage, and an unexpected tragedy really rips her life apart. But then 2 years later, as she's starting to move past her grief, she decides to go back to this house that she used to live in when she was a child. But she discovers that since she has left the town, there have been all of these unexplained tragedies happening, and she's starting to wonder if they could all be connected to something in the house. She starts to wonder if these events could all be linked to this entity that her grandmother fought in the 1920s, and she starts to wonder if her teenage son could have somehow like awoken this entity and like caused them problems again. I thought the concept for this one was so cool, and I am always down to read a haunted house horror book. Like, that's one of my top favorite tropes. And then the last 400-page book recommendation that I have is The Bright Lands by John Fram, and this one comes in at about 480 pages. And in this small town in Texas, the star quarterback goes missing, and so we follow our protagonist Joel, who's the quarterback's older brother, who has moved to New York because he's a queer man who never felt accepted in the small town in Texas where he grew up. But he's returning to the small town because he's trying to find out the truth about what happened to his brother. This one was just really creepy and atmospheric, and I loved all of the elements of like the football team and what was going on with them. This book not only had like great mystery, but it also had some really creepy horror scenes, and the ending of this book is just absolute chaos in the best way. I really enjoyed this one, and I can't wait because John Fram has a new book publishing in 2024, so I'm really excited to see what he does next because this was his debut novel, and I thought it was fantastic, so I can't wait to read the next thing. Now, starting with the 500+ page horror novels, we're kicking off the list with The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, and this one comes in at about 530 pages. Now, Chuck Wendig is a horror author that I feel like I could widely recommend, especially to fans of like Stephen King. I don't know what it is about his writing, but it reminds me so much of like old school Stephen King. But The Book of Accidents ended up being one of my favorites from this author. In this story, we're following this guy named Nathan, who he used to live in this house in the country with his very abusive father. And then we also follow this woman named Maddie, who saw something as a child that she probably shouldn't have seen, and now she's still haunted by this trauma. And now we're following Nathan and Maddie as they're adults. They both married each other, and both of these characters have a lot of trauma from their past, but they're moving back to the small town where he grew up because his father has recently passed away, and now there's some strange things happening to their son, Oliver. This one definitely has the creepy vibe of like the entire town being like haunted or cursed by something. I mean, even the premise says, long ago, something sinister, something hungry walked in the tunnels in the mountains and the coal mines of their hometown in Pennsylvania. And I really do love horror novels like this where it really feels like the whole town is being haunted by something. I feel like there's quite a number of horror books on this list actually that has that trope, and I really like that trope. And then next up we have Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This one comes in at about 588 pages, and this was one of my top favorite books that I read last year, and this was one that I was really surprised by. It's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, you know? This one's definitely more like horror, but it's kind of like historical fiction fantasy vibes in a way, because this one involves a lot of demons and like almost the idea of these like magical abilities where like this character can talk without moving his lips. Like, it's like he can communicate with his mind and like different things like that. I just wasn't sure if this was gonna be my kind of book or not, but this book was absolutely everything. Like, the writing in this book was so stunning, and these characters, like, I think about these characters all the time. The main premise of this book is that we're following this man Juan and his son Gaspar. Gaspar's mother has recently died under mysterious circumstances, and so both of them are going to be going on the road and trying to find answers to what really happened to his mother. This book definitely reads more kind of like literary fiction in my opinion, where it's just very beautifully written, it's very thought thought-provoking. We really get to know these characters. I mean, we move back and forth between like the 1980s back to the 1960s, and this book definitely jumps around in time and we get to know all of the characters very personally. I don't really even know how to explain this book. It just really touched me. It really moved me. I've been thinking about these characters ever since I read this book last year, and it's definitely one of my top favorites that I would highly recommend checking out. And then the next book on this list is going to be Black River Orchard by Chuck Wendig. This is another book from this author. This one comes in at about 620 pages. This was actually the longest book that I read last year, and I'm so glad that I did because I ended up loving it a lot. And in this story, it's really interesting because we're following these characters who live in this small town where these apple trees start growing that have these apples that are almost like magical or cursed. It's really interesting because when the people in the town start eating these apples, it's like their bodies start improving. It's like people who needed glasses like no longer need glasses, or people are starting to get stronger than they were before. And we follow a number of different characters who live in this small town, but the main characters that we're following are the people who run this apple orchard. It's this girl and her dad. And this book was just so fascinating. Like, this is another one where it kind of feels like the entire town is like cursed or haunted by these apples. I think Chuck Wendig is such an incredible writer because I never imagined that I would be like afraid of an apple until I read this book. Like, the way that he writes this shit is just so interesting to me. I honestly can't decide which of the two Chuck Wendig books I've loved. I can't decide which one's my favorite. I think they're both so great for different reasons, but I feel like this one so far has been staying on my mind a lot longer. There are some moments in this book that I will literally never forget because the imagery is just sticking in my brain so hard. And then of course we have Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which this one comes in at about 653 pages. I don't even know if I have to explain the premise of Salem's Lot to you because I feel like this book is so popular and so well known. I actually have an entire reading vlog dedicated to my experience reading Salem's Lot for the first time when I read it a few years ago, so if you want to see that vlog, I'll have it linked down below. I mean, this one also checks a lot of boxes for me, you know, because there's this house in the town that everybody thinks is haunted, and in this story we're following this protagonist named Ben, who is a writer, and he's returning to Jerusalem's Lot because he wants to explore this mysterious house. And then there's these children going missing in the town. There's vampire vibes. Like, if you know, you know. Salem's Lot is just a really fun time. I was actually really impressed by how much I loved this one. And then the next book on this list is going to be Uzumaki by Junji Ito. This one is about 653 pages as well, and this one is actually a manga, but I thought I would include it on this list because this one is one of my favorites. It is on the lengthier side as well, but this one is actually really cool, and it was actually one of the first mangas that I ever read, and it just got me really obsessed with Junji Ito. And I think if you're a fan of horror books and you've been thinking about checking out manga, I think Junji Ito would be the perfect author to recommend to you because Junji Ito just has such unique horror ideas in his manga, and I just think they're really creepy and unique and worth checking out. But Uzumaki in particular is really cool because we're following this small town who's cursed by the idea of these spirals. Like, they get cursed by spirals and they start seeing spirals everywhere, and I swear after you read this book you will also start seeing spirals everywhere and feel like you're losing your mind. No, but for real, it's just a fun time. I think if you're interested in checking out some manga and you don't know where to start, I think Junji Ito would be a great recommendation if you're a fan of horror. And then the next book on this list is going to be Battle Royale, which comes in at about 656 pages. This is a book that I was absolutely shocked by. Like, I did not think that I was going to end up loving this book the way that I did, and then this book made it into like my top 5 reads of the year when I read it a few years ago. Like, I could not believe how much fun this book was. This one genre-wise is a little bit hard to pin down because I put it on this video because I do think there are a lot of horrific elements of this story, but Battle Royale is a classic, and it's a story about these junior high school students who get dropped off on this island together, and they are all given weapons and they're told that they all have to kill each other until there's only one left standing. I feel like there are so many stories that we know and love that were probably very inspired by Battle Royale. Like, I feel like Battle Royale was like the first of its kind, and I was not thinking that I was gonna enjoy this book as much as I did, but the crazy thing is that this book starts off right away. Like, this author wastes no fucking time. Like, it just gets right to the action within like the first chapter from beginning to end. I was so entertained with this book. Like, there was not a dull moment. This is definitely one of those books that it is completely justified that this story is nearly 700 pages long because it is just so interesting from beginning to end. There is no filler chapters, nothing like that. I just thought it was so entertaining and so good. And by the end of this book, I was actually really connected to the characters, and I was surprised by the way that this book ended because, you know, with a book like this, I feel like there's only so many ways that a story like this can end, right? Like, I feel like in some ways you might think it's kind of predictable, but for me personally, I loved the ending of this. I thought it was so interesting, so I would highly recommend checking out Battle Royale. I think it's so good. And then next up on the list we have The Shining by Stephen King, which this one comes in at about 659 pages. This is another classic right here where, like, I don't even feel like I need to explain to you what this book is about. Basically, we're following this man named Jack Torrance Torrance, he takes this job working at the Overlook Hotel during the winter season. So the hotel is going to be like closed off to the rest of the world, and him and his family are going to be taking care of this hotel. And slowly but surely, Jack Torrance starts to feel like he's losing his mind. This one is especially perfect to read during the winter because of the atmosphere in this book. You know, like there's snowstorms happening. These people are isolated at this hotel for a long extended period of time. The cabin fever is really getting to Jack Torrance, and there's been a history at this hotel of like these men murdering their families while they're staying there. And so this one is definitely more psychologically scary, and sometimes I think books like this can be even more effective than like your typical horror books, because the horror in this book is a lot more subtle, but it's like the fear of your own parent can be really scary when you're a kid. If you feel like your parent is losing their mind and you don't know if you can trust them, that shit is really scary and really real. And I think The Shining is just such a classic book for those reasons. I think it's great. I think you should check it out. All right, the next book on this list is going to be Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. This one comes in at about 705 pages. This is definitely one of the longest books that I've ever read, but I think it was worth it. I think this book is so interesting. So in this story, we're following this young boy named Christopher who's 7 years old, and one night he disappears into the woods outside of his house, and then he returns a few days later, but he's very different, or he's acting very different than he was before. And with this book, I will warn you that, you know, it is 700 pages, like it's a long one, and in my opinion, I think the last 200 pages of this book were kind of shit. Like, I don't think the ending of this book is very good, and I don't like the direction the story ended up going, but I had to include this book on this list because the first 500 pages of this book, it's literally some of my favorite horror that I've ever read in my life. Like, I still think about this book all the time, even though I read it back in 2019. Like, it's been 5 years since I've read this, but I still think about some of the scenes in this book. And I think the first 500 pages were so effective and so creepy and so interesting. You know, it's a real shame that this book really like dropped off in those last 200 pages, so it's hard to recommend this book overall, you know, because I really do think the last 200 pages kind of suck. Like, I would just warn you in advance, they kind of suck, but I still do think this book is worth it for those first 500 pages because it's some of my favorite shit that I've ever read. This book genuinely gave me a fear of deer, and like the way that the deer were written in this book, oh my gosh, it just creeped me out. It got under my skin. I still think about it all the time. So for those reasons, I would definitely still recommend checking out Imaginary Friend. Even though I don't think the ending is very good, I still think it's worth the read personally. And then the last book that I have on this list, which is the longest book that I have on this list, any guesses? Yes, it's gonna be It by Stephen King, which my copy of It comes in at about 1,156 pages. And this one is the longest book that I have ever read personally. I mean, it's gotta be this one or The Stand. The Stand was a long one as well, but I didn't end up enjoying The Stand nearly as much as I enjoyed this one. I don't think I need to explain what this book is about because everybody knows It, the clown, Pennywise, 80s vibes, young children in a town, kind of giving Stranger Things vibes. Like, I'm sure Stranger Things was very inspired by It. And this is yet another one of those stories where it kind of feels like the entire town is being haunted by this curse, by this entity. And Pennywise in this story, you know, is very interesting because you might not know, but he's actually not just a clown. He's like an entity. He can be whatever he wants to be. And it's scary and it's weird and it's creepy. And like, yes, some aspects of this book are controversial. Like, there's definitely some things that happen towards the end of this book that are just bizarre and outrageous and unnecessary. If you know, you know. But at the same time, this book is just such a classic. It's hard to not recommend because this book clearly made such an impact on like society and like future stories and pop culture. And like, do I think this book needs to be 1,000 pages long? No, absolutely not. Like, this probably could have been cut down by like 400 or 500 pages. But reading this book was such an experience. Like, I had such a great time reading this. I actually read it a number of years ago before I started vlogging on this channel, but it was so much fun because I sectioned it off into like 200 pages a day and I just read this all within 1 week and I just had the time of my life. Like, it was really fun to read this book. Those are all of the long horror book recommendations that I have for you today. Hopefully you found something on this list that sounds appealing to you. If you have any recommendations for any long horror books that you think I could enjoy based off of these books on this list, then please let me know any of your recommendations in the comments. Also, let me know if any of these books are also some of your favorites that you would highly recommend others to pick up as well. And once again, just a reminder, I have a number of other horror recommendation videos, so if you're looking for something else, I'll have all of them linked down below in the description. And I do have the short horror recs video as well. If you're a person who doesn't really like the longer books and you'd rather have the shorter books, then you can check out that recommendation video down below. And thank you so much for watching and for hanging out as always. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!